my speech. Okay. Here we go. Anyway, we try to foster a sense of solidarity and freedom to speak amongst our attendees while addressing significant topics that encompass local and global policies. So along with other DAGR events and programs, it serves as a platform for education and ultimately to get out the vote, which is our job. But tonight, I welcome you all. We're thrilled to gather for an exclusive opportunity that promises to be enlightening as it is engaging. It is our honor to host talented author Lydia Kiesling. She is the best-selling and award-winning author of Golden State and is with us to delve into her latest thought-provoking novel, Mobility. There are several compelling themes in mobility, social and political, and Lydia has been on the forefront of many. She is deeply involved in practical politics in her home city of Portland, Oregon, and helped to win a key battle for universal childcare, and is active other causes that we wouldn't call progressive here in Greece, but rather mainstream across Europe. And adding to the richness of today's literary journey, we are privileged to have the renowned poet Alicia Stallings. And I will pass the baton to our chair, Brady, to introduce Alicia. Brady?
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Kafeneion is one of our chances to think great thoughts, but mostly to hear interesting people. I'm representing today our secretary, Jan Sanders, our media coordinator, Alkman Granitsas, Nikki Falouris, our events coordinator, Catherine Drake, our Athens chapter rep, and Todd Pierce, who is a colleague, diplomatic colleague, was the press attaché here, and he's come back to Athens with advanced copies of his new book, and Regina Tassitano, my spouse. We're waiting for John Psaropoulos, the eminent television, print, and internet journalist who was once my editor and is always my friend, who is married to tonight's gracious interlocutor, Alicia Stallings. And you've probably heard of Alicia. She grew up in Decatur, Georgia, studied classics at University of Georgia and Oxford. These days, she's dividing her time between Athens and Oxford. In Oxford, she's performing the extremely onerous duties involved in being Oxford Professor of Poetry. Now, her poetic output is remarkable. Her poetry collections include, oh, can someone bring me those books? Like a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, Olives, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there are several others that I don't happen to have in front of me. But she's keep an eye out for her very fine volume of selected poems called This Afterlife. We were, as in the words of Rudyard Kipling, a little warm, but not at all astonished when Alicia won her MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. Having an actual stable genius in our Athens community is wonderful, not only for her poetic insights, but also for the generosity with which she pays attention to those who need it, and not just us. In particular, the children of the Athens refugee community are fortunate in having her as their mentor and friend. Like Lydia, Alicia has 2 children. Like Lydia, Alicia has a remarkable sensitivity to the oddness of places. Her version of Hades in her poetry comes off really as no odder than either Houston or Baku in Lydia's writings. I think Alicia and Lydia have a lot to talk about. Thank you very much for being here, Alicia, Lydia, and everyone.
Thank you very much, Brady, for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight, actually in Brady's apartment, and talking to Lydia across the seas. Lydia and I are also, I still call it Twitter mutuals, and I feel like I keep up a little bit with some of Lydia's concerns and so forth via that medium. I read this book. My camera doesn't want to focus on it, I see. I read this book some months ago, and I was going back through it today in order to kind of remind myself of the characters and the places and so forth. But I didn't get very far because I simply started rereading it. I think the book just really draws you in, and especially I think for expats and for people who have spent a lot of their life living off of US soil, there's just so much that's immediately familiar about the descriptions of places. And I love also the wonderful details from different time periods and so on. I mean, it's a quite ambitious book also. And I was gonna start to ask Lydia about this, which is, you know, I'm a poet. I read a lot of fiction, but I don't really keep up with fiction trends and reviews necessarily as much as I might. But this idea of a realistic social novel with you know, through written characters that is also grappling with larger social issues, is that seen as almost like Victorian? Is this something you can do now? Obviously you do it, and you're in like the New York Times bestseller list, but do you get any pushback about that from more literary corners of the internet world and the book world? Because it seems like there's something of a Dickensian ambition in a way, even though this is a, well, as it is also a very readable and enjoyable book.
Thank you for that question, and thank you all for being here and hosting me and putting me in conversation with Alicia, who I just admire so much. And Alicia, thank you for spending your time this way and on the book. I also have a cat friend who really needs to be part of the proceedings. I think I'm contractually obligated to say that it was not a New York Times bestseller, but spent 1 week on the USA Today bestseller list, which still, you are allowed to put you're a national bestseller, but I think the New York Times sends goons after you if you just misrepresent yourself there. So it's interesting. I think I mean, there are some, you know, major novels I still think are, or novelists who I still think are considered, you know, major, even though they sometimes fall into disfavor. But someone like Jonathan Franzen, I think, you know, is writing kind of big character driven stories. I think some readers were confused by mobility because I got the cat's trying to knock the computer off. Go away. I'm both interested in sort of those big stories and very drawn to them, but feel very ill-equipped to write them in the sense of understanding how to do plot. I think plot is generally considered to be very sort of crucial for those big like Dickensian efforts. So I strove for kind of the scale, but I am still obsessed with staying for a long time in moments and describing places and describing feelings. And that's really what I feel kind of called to do as a writer, but nobody usually wants to read something that's just like only that. So in a sense, this book was kind of my awkward effort to jam what I feel comfortable doing and what I sort of start with, which is like kind of images and feelings of being in a place, into something that looked like a story. And I ended up using sort of world events and just kind of like the scaffolding of one person's life as the plot, which I think some readers are still like very perplexed by. But for others, it did manage to kind of convey that sense of scale. I still don't know how to do plot, and I really admire people who do. But I think with both this and my previous novel, a lot of the architecture of both of them really in the end was about like solving problems for myself and making it possible to write the book at all. In my previous book, it was setting it over a period of 10 days. And then with mobility, it's setting it over a period of decades, because having so much time pass automatically kind of adds weight and adds a trajectory, which is basically filling the hole left by my inability to come up with, complex plots.
But I think that worked very well. And I have to ask you about how you feel about Bunny. So the central character who we meet as a 15-year-old diplomatic brat, I think maybe even in her own phrase, in Baku, and she's at some kind of 4th of July picnic. She really pulled me in. I think there is this sense of, I personally liked her very much. And I'm not sure like I'm supposed to like her as much as I do. There's a way in which I think there's a feeling of authorial ambiguity maybe towards her, but ultimately she becomes a very I'm pulled in by the frankness which we learn about her teenageness. I mean, it reminds me, I shouldn't keep going back to Dickens, but this idea, or even of Jane Eyre, of this idea of taking a quite young heroine and dealing with those problems of youth, which are, feeling terribly awkward and not being a child and not being an adult. And I loved the hyper focus on having the right brand name of shoes or makeup, which I think was presented not in a shallow way. Clearly, as we go through the book, we're aware that, okay, this is consumerism and this is part of the problem. But in the moment, I'm really struck by how accurate so much of those cultural references are, getting the right music and the right television show, and how that kind of instantly, for those of us who were alive during those ancient times, it kind of brought everything back. There was almost this Proustian rush to hear Dawson's Creek, like of these very, very hyper specific memories. And as I was rereading the beginning, I note that one of the books that she herself name checks is Bridget Jones' Diary. And that to me kind of went through the book in a certain way. I don't know how you felt about this. I think it's an absolutely brilliant comic novel that's somewhat underrated as a comic novel. The movies are fine. But in the novel, it's very clear that Bridget Jones is much smarter than people are interpreting her as. And I get that sense with Bunny, where she says she's not good with languages, and yet she's constantly picking up vocabulary, and she's in this very high performing family. And so perhaps it's kind of judgmental of her own accomplishments and so forth. But even in the way the chapters begin, where you've got these numbers, which I guess are the price of oil per barrel. There's a little bit of that from the Bridget Jones, where every diary entry starts with how many cigarettes are smoked, how many calories, this kind of strange accounting. I know this is kind of a very side question, but it felt like there was an element of that pulling through the book, of kind of at once acknowledging this sort of chick lit while delving into quote unquote much more serious issues.
I have to thank you, because it had never occurred to me to make the connection between those high and low oil prices for the year and the Bridget Jones convention of the cigarettes and calories and units of drink. But I mean that they are certainly related. And I absolutely love that comparison. I think so yeah, Bridget Jones is like a formative novel for me. I read it at a young age, and I think I agree, it's a brilliant comic novel. I think looking at it now and thinking about being a very young person and reading it really drives home kind of what women are up against, I think, in a lot of ways, because it is written around her fixation on her own weight and her sort of her constant quest for self-improvement, but in a way that's sort of framed around her appearance and her, like, but I mean, it's not wrong to like want to smoke and drink less, I guess. Those are good things. But and I think with Mobility and with Bunny as a character, I think of it as a feminist novel, in the sense that feminism means taking the lives and the concerns and the sort of structures that dictate women's lives very seriously, in the sense of talking those things, talking about makeup or clothing or sort of desire and how it's shaped by the world around us, depending on who we are. That's very serious to me. And so, even though there is, I had a friend who called it ironic distance, between the author and Bunny, there is a lot of kind of self-loathing that is written into parts of Bunny, but there's also love and really kind of understanding her because she's formed in the same kind of crucible that I myself am, and we share a lot of DNA. So in the sense of, if it's a feminist novel, it has to take everything about the character very seriously. So that means kind of lovingly describing those sort of ways that she is in the world, but then also having more of a critical eye to it, because I think part of the way that some women are still socialized, is to have a kind of helplessness in the world, and I think Bunny leans into that in certain moments, to use a kind of catchphrase of our time. One book, so Bridget Jones is very. I thought about it a lot as I was writing the book. I think about it a lot. I was thinking recently, like, what would I say if I saw my 9-year-old who's now reading just books that she finds around the house? She hasn't quite stepped into like fully reading like adult books, but she has curiosity about them. And were I to see her, if she's like 10 or 11 picking up Bridget Jones, like, I think I would have a panic attack, but it wouldn't be because I think that the book itself is like, a bomb, but it has taken on this like very outsized presence in my mind and just sort of representative of a lot of things of how women move through the world and how, yeah, I really, I talked recently with someone who said that the two genders, if you're talking about English, like the British novel, it's Lucky Jim and Bridget Jones. And so Lucky Jim is like the male comic campus, like hapless novel. And then Bridget Jones is sort of the women's version of that, which I thought was an interesting point. But another novel that I thought a lot about when I was kind of constructing this character is a novel called Oil! By Upton Sinclair, who famously wrote The Jungle, and he was kind of a muckraking socialist journalist and writer. And Oil is actually like a terrible novel in many ways. It is so long. It observes no conventions about like how long a scene should be, or being didactic and like stuffing kind of information into fictional scenarios. The whole book is that, but it's also was really interesting to me because it follows a boy whose name is Bunny, from being a young teenager or kind of a tween into manhood, and it's his kind of like political awakening and journey. And one thing that annoyed me about Bunny is that he's such a kind of like a Mary Sue of a character. Like, he receives the lessons from people and he absorbs them and he becomes better as a result. And I was writing Mobility in the Trump era, and just seeing things around me. And it's not only the Trump era, I was seeing things go to shit long before Trump came into office, but I was certainly writing in this kind of bleak mindset. So I wanted to think about a political journey that kind of went sideways, where someone, has is observant and perceptive, but because of, the era they live in, and they're sort of like the conditions shaped by their maybe like class and race and gender, they just take a different path of like becoming some political firebrand. They just sort of get along in the end. So I think there's a tension to Bunny that is never answered by the novel, and I can't really answer it myself, where originally I was actually more sort of cruel to her, and I think more sarcastic in the writing, but the drafts I would read, as I was trying to figure out what the voice was, they were just really airless and kind of cynical and cruel. And it's not enjoyable to read that. Like you can bully your characters and be right, you know, and kind of accosting them for their moral failings, but it's not fun to read because nobody wants to be lectured. And I think there still is some kind of lecturing in the novel, but there's also love for Bunny and kind of understanding of her, which I think was important to make it actually something that people wanted to spend time with.
I think that comes across, and the thing is, there are people who lecture. I mean, that sort of first scene at the picnic, there are people who are aware of the tensions of Azerbaijan and oil, and everyone is kind of right. You know, and she has situations where, you know, she doesn't want to talk to Republicans, or you know, she's seen Al Gore's movie and she knows it's true. And then it's so believable how she kind of, you know, she takes one job as a copywriter and, you know, she ends up working for, you know, quote, clean energy. And I love the bit with the pink petroleum uh group of women in oil, where like on the one side, yes, it's feminist, but you know, okay, we also have fossil fuels. And I think I remember on Twitter you're going to something maybe undercover to research the novel, to some club or something like that. Was that part of the research of the novel? Did you attend some of these events?
I did. And actually it's sort of, I mean, like the pink petro stuff is just taken from life. Like it's so, it's, you know, if it's kind of on the nose, it's just because it's real, basically. Although they have rebranded and they're now called something, they're called Ally now. But when I was writing the novel, the way that fiction, I mean, I'm not going to like talk to a poet about the how underpaid this industry is, but if you write a nonfiction book, generally you write a proposal first and you sell the proposal to a publisher, and then you are given some money and you write the book. With fiction, you have to write the whole book first, and then you bring it to a publisher and hope that they publish it, or your agent brings it to a publisher. So there are some novelists, there are some exceptions to this, but generally the rule for novels is you're basically writing it ahead of time. So knowing that, I couldn't justify, you know, spending money to like fly places and do sort of serious on the ground research. But I also had this kind of ambition for the novel to include places that I have not spent time in. And I knew that it would require research. This was also, I was writing a lot of it during the peak kind of COVID era, so I couldn't go anywhere even if I could afford to. But I knew that it would be very important to go, but I had this scheme that I would do the draft of the novel to a point where I could hopefully find a publisher to buy it, and then I could justify doing some travel. And I was very, very fortunate that that is how it worked out. But yeah, initially I was just watching YouTube videos and trying to find anything I could online. So I watched a lot of conference proceedings that were available. For a while I was on all these like really awful mailing lists from the oil industry just so I could find out about these like webinars. But then, yes, after I sold the book, I went to Baku for only a few days, unfortunately. And I went to Houston and I went to the Petroleum Club and I said that I wanted to have my wedding there so that I could go inside. Once I was there, I realized I could have just gone there and said, can I see inside the Petroleum Club? But it was kind of fun to be like slightly undercover. And I also went to a Women in Energy luncheon. It was an award luncheon. And I went there as a member of the press, which is, you could get just a ticket as a press member. And I am, you know, I write for newspapers and things. So technically it was true, but it was a little, they put me at one of the tables with like two of the awardees. And so they said, oh, you know, you're part of the press, you know, who do you write for? And I've written for like the New York Times. So I said, well, I sometimes write for, you know, the New York Times and like a couple. So I think they were under the impression that I was there to cover this event, like for the New York Times, which was certainly not the case. But yes, I did have a chance to go in person to that. And that was so important. Like I had already written a scene that took place in something like that, but I was able to add so much more detail as a consequence of really being there. And it was also just, yeah, it's interesting just as any, I think writers are often very curious and nosy. And so it was fun just in that sense to be there and watch the goings on.
I think there's an element also poets of writers being kind of spies that have gone into a different a different sort of thing. One little side question that I feel I have to ask for this particular group. There you've talked about there's some of your DNA in Bunny, and is there some DNA in other family members? I mean, I think there's maybe a little bit of people we recognize in the father, although it's clearly not this exactly the same person. But it was kind of fun to look in the book and say, "Oh, you know, I can see just a little bit of our friend in that person," and how then when you're writing and maybe using aspects of family, does that become awkward when you're sharing your work with them? Do people read your work and comment on it? One of the nice things about being a poet is generally your family members don't read your work at all, and you can write all kinds of things.
Well, I think so. For my first novel, which was about a young mother and her child, and it was also in the first person, people just assume that it was like a memoir, and people will still say like, "I love when you did this in your book," and I have to sort of be like, well, it wasn't in fact me, but who did that? But I think with this book, I felt a lot of anxiety about the writing process, especially in the beginning before I really knew what I was doing, because I knew that I wanted to write about a foreign service family, and I grew up in a foreign service family, and my father is here, and he was the foreign service part of that. And I mean, I wanted to write about it because it is sort of a totalizing profession, and I think there are a few jobs that are like that, where one person has the job but the whole family sort of experiences the job in a very specific way, in ways that are wonderful, but can also be very challenging. And so I was very interested in describing that experience. And then also, I think it's not unique to the foreign service, but in the jobs where people are going to another country in service of the work and taking their whole families, there is a worldliness, but there's also an insularity. And I think I remember the base no longer exists in Athens, but I remember when I was a small child, we'd go to the base and then it would be this sort of mini American space carved out. And so there's sort of this odd kind of like parochialism in a way that can go along with living all around the world. And I find that so interesting. And I went to a boarding school with many Aramco kids, we called them. So people who had the kind of oil overseas upbringing, which had its own very fascinating dynamics. So I was nervous about that. And I think I resolved it mostly by trying to make it more about the circumstances than about the people themselves. Because the father in Mobility it has some sort of general, like they're the same age and they're white men and they were drawn to the foreign service. And I think there are certain personality types that there are just similarities across people who share that description. And the mother, had a very different like profession. She was in the novel, she's a flight attendant. But I was still, I felt very nervous about it. And then I will say my dad and my mom, I showed them both when I had when it was in like the early galley state, before it was going to become a galley, like an advanced copy. I sent them both the PDF and they read it, and they both actually, they came back with just like a list of typos, which I took as like, I was very touched by, because I think that was like a way of really being very generous about the fact that I had sort of cannibalized some aspects of our lives. And my dad, pointed out some really important kind of foreign service, like administrative details that I had missed. And that, added a lot that I had gotten them right. And yeah, my mom did the same thing. So I'm grateful to them that they took it so well and that they didn't take it personally, because I'm sure it feels horrifying, when your child is like, I'm writing a novel that like kind of might look like our life, but is not. I mean, but it really truly is not our lives ultimately. Yeah. So thanks, Dad, for being nice about it.
I think I noticed this through the platform formerly known as Twitter. There is a new, do you call it COP? What do you call it? One of these conferences. This is going to Baku, and there's a way where the book kind of almost looks forward to that. Or what I'm really curious, have you had experiences where people from the fossil fuel industry have been reading your book or getting back to you? Have you felt you've changed any minds? Have you had any kind of engagement or anyone contact you from that part of the world?
I have. That has been so fascinating. So one of the things I did when I had when I did have an advanced copy, I had someone who was from Azerbaijan, who grew up in Azerbaijan during the time period described. I had her read the book, and just as like a paid sort of second set of eyes, just to give her notes and feedback. And I did the same with an oil scholar, who I actually met from Twitter, and and then I heard him once on NPR, and I was like, well, he really clearly knows what he's talking about. And so I had him read sort of for an oil perspective, because I was anxious about getting, you have this like nightmare that someone's going to come and say, well, I've worked in this industry for 20 years and like you've got everything wrong and you're clearly an idiot, and so no one should read this novel. So I, did some due diligence to try and prevent that from happening. But it's been so interesting. I gave a reading in Houston, and a young woman was there, and she brought her mom, and she raised her hand at the end and she said, I work at Exxon and I want to know how you wrote this book, because, and like, did you have that job? Because it's so similar to my work. And she was like, she felt very seen. I think she used the words like, I feel seen. And then she like took a photo with me at the end. And I was kind of rattled by that, actually, because I mean, I was gratified from the novelist sense, like, oh, I nailed it according to this person. So clearly, all my research like was worth something. But I was kind of like, well, it's not that she should read the book and be like, I can no longer work for Exxon, but it's just been interesting to, like, some people in the oil industry have I think been sort of excited to see something about their experience in the novel, and maybe not focus so much on the like meta part of it. I think in some cases because it's a tension they already live with, or in the case of a place like Houston, so many people are part of that industry that it's like it becomes irrelevant, sort of like what the rest of the world thinks, because they have a unique awareness, I would say, of how ubiquitous oil and gas is in everyday life. So I think it's easy to be like, well, people have these criticisms, but like this work powers the world in sort of a very literal sense. So I think that I did get one email from someone who said she had worked like for Chevron for 40 years. And she said, I am wondering, like, maybe I just made a huge mistake. But she kind of like laughed it off a little bit, but it was clear that she was thinking about it. And so that was interesting. I heard from some people in Southeast Texas who were just upset because whoever read the audiobook like mispronounced so many things from, which normally I'm mad at my publisher about that. But yeah, I've heard from people, and they are, what I'm happy about is that I think I take it as sort of a compliment to the book that they seem sort of thoughtful about it rather than just like angry or dismissive. Although in the case of the Exxon woman, I'm just like, was I not clear enough that I think that oil and gas like needs to end as a in order to stop us from cooking?
I think I know we need to leave some time for questions, but I think that that's one of the quite successful things that you do in the novel, is that nobody is dehumanized. Even the head of the family-owned oil firm is sort of likable on a personal level. Although there's that really chilling moment when he's giving a speech, and you feel like this is where the novelist really is wanting you to pay attention. We don't think in economic cycles. We don't think in election cycles. We don't think in presidential administrations. In this industry, we think in Earth time, geological time. There's no short-term problem we can't wait out, can't think our way through. If he put his fingers together and jabbed them forward through the air, if you keep your business organized right. Bunny felt goosebumps on the back of her neck. And I mean, I sort of did also, in the sense of, okay, he clearly doesn't understand what geological time means in terms of fossil fuels and the future of life on Earth. But just that was, I think, a well-incorporated speech that speaks over the heads of the characters to the audience without lecturing. And I thought that that was just very well handled. And it comes back again, this idea of geological time. But I wanted to ask you, maybe, and then we'll go to questions. In poetry, there's a lot of talk about eco-poetics. I'm not really sure what that means. I think it just means poetry that is aware of the climate catastrophe coming our way. But poetics suggests it has something to do with aesthetics or something technical or some other school. And this, obviously poets are addressing this. There are whole programs now, eco-poetics and conferences, when obviously this is really a case where poetry makes nothing happen. But it's an interesting choice that you choose to go into the future. And you have this very potentially dark ending that also has hope in terms of a baby, but it's like, and this is what's coming, and it's coming much faster, possibly even than that ending shows us in terms of everyday life and so forth. And it's an interesting choice. And I think a critic has said this is a novel as a genius piece of misdirection, like that it's trying to slide in this thing. I mean, I think the bunny and her mother and all of that works very well. And then at the, in your afterword, you do say nothing is inevitable. So I'm sort of interested in what your feelings are about the end of the book, what you wanted that to do, and how you felt that may or may not go with people taking action.
That's another sort of tension that is unresolved in the novel. I think initially I didn't want to have anything from the future because I wanted it to sort of go it's like it goes without saying that all of these choices end somewhere really terrible. But I don't know, at some point I just wrote something from the future, and then we had the Pacific Northwest heat dome here a couple of years ago, where it was 116 degrees in Portland, Portland is not set up for that. And a lot of people died, elderly people in homes that were not set up for hot weather. And so then it sort of felt more urgent that I have something in there. And I think one of the things I struggled with is that there's no hope for people who are already dead from climate change, which is a lot of people. And so even though I think there's something irresponsible about making it kind of seem like it's this foreclosed future, that there's nothing we can change, it dishonors the people who have had their futures foreclosed already, and who will not be able to avoid catastrophe, even if, I put a heat pump in my house tomorrow. So I wanted to find a way to both acknowledge the horrors that are already taking place as a consequence of climate change and sort of human choices around climate and engineering and energy, while also like pointing out that it can, there's still degrees of bad in an overall sense that it can be. So I think I was kind of like, if I'm going to have this ending, I also need to have like something in the acknowledgements that sort of like, that it doesn't have to be like this. And also to point out that I think something that's absent from the book is the people who really are working on this every day in a frontline way, and communities who are affected by it every day. And the reason I don't put them in is because I don't think those are the stories that I am good at telling. I think I'm very good at telling, or sort of knowing through lived experience, what certain kinds of elite spaces are like, and the conversations that people have, and the the ways that people talk and think about sort of their own political choices and political valence of their lives. And so that's what I wanted to do. But it felt weird to write kind of a climate story where it's all about like the people who aren't doing anything about climate, or at the most are kind of yelling about it, but not about the people who are really experiencing it on a daily basis. And of course, as the book shows, everyone ultimately is going to experience it in some way or another, but there are levels of insulation that some people have against climate catastrophe that others do not. So I think, yeah, there's kind of an awkward way of trying to like acknowledge all of those things while knowing that the book can only be what the book is. And I can't sort of write every single nuance of the world crisis into it.
Well, I think that it does work very well the way, I mean, sometimes you have even the do-gooders just come off as equally insulated as the people who are kind of fumbling along in their lives. And I think it's just very realistic and humanizing. And I don't know if while you were writing it, it felt like a way of dealing with climate despair. At least I'm acknowledging it. You know, I know you have young children, so for me, it was actually, I think, not a depressing read. I think because of the pleasure of dealing with the characters and going through these time periods and so forth. But it was certainly thought-provoking. I think Sarah Jane may want to open it up for some questions at this point.
Okay, thank you, ladies, so much. That was just incredibly interesting, all of your insights. And I do have already a question in the queue. I guess I would prefer that each person asks their question themselves. It's good to put it in the queue so we can put people in line. But the first one that I have is from Christina Calbos.
Hi. First off, I just want to say I deeply enjoyed this book, and I really appreciate you writing a character that I felt I could so intimately connect with. I also grew up as an embassy kid, and I know our parents overlapped in Athens, so I particularly loved the shout out to Athens and nostalgia surrounding that. I truly felt like maybe as the other woman you spoke with, truly seen in the character, but also, of course, that it focused on such a universal issue as climate change. And I think that was part of, like, I found Bunny's character incredibly relatable, but also sometimes unlikable because it sort of held up a mirror to the parts of ourselves that maybe we'd like to ignore. And I found myself grappling with this issue of compromise versus complicity and applying it to other big and terrifying issues that we're facing today. Also right now in an issue like that, and how we all just sort of carry on our day-to-day, you know, we're also surviving, right? And that this was sort of bringing up an issue for a population, an audience that sees themselves as progressive, but also questioning how much complicity is in that. So should we see Bunny's character in the last section of the book as sort of a cautionary tale? What does it say for us in our future that we maybe relate to Bunny so deeply? And because we're this group of Democrats abroad Greece, this is something I think about in terms of our elections. You know, is it enough anymore to say, vote for anyone who's not Trump, basically? Like, at least we're not the other guy. But of course, you know, I think it's a challenge because there's a reality to that. But there's also, it's challenging when we see a lot of our leaders maybe even ignoring these issues or complicit in some of these big world issues right now.
Thank you so much for both the kind words and for asking that question. I mean, I just wrote in uncommitted on my ballot in the Oregon primary a week ago, so I am really struggling with this right now. And I I think Bunny is a cautionary tale. Even though, I think Bunny has a lot of ambivalence written into her. One thing I think is clear about Bunny, or want to be clear, is that because Bunny sort of outsources like action to other people and outsources or just kind of lets things happen around her, and because she basically she finds herself in a place and she tries to fit in with what that place is. And in her case, she goes home, to where her family's from, and she ends up in the oil industry. It's an industry dominated by white men who are older than she is. It has a very kind of hierarchical and exclusionary way of or structure. Even among other industries, the oil and gas industry is very, very male dominated, and very dominated by white people. And so any kind of like diversity in oil and gas means white women. That's kind of like where it is and there's some really interesting books about that. But because she finds herself there, and so she says, okay, well, this is the ladder that I'm on, so I just need to like follow their rules and climb this ladder and try and meet the expectations of this hierarchy. And then in the end, they lay her off. They're not like she brings loyalty to that position, but it is not reciprocated. Which is, I think, there's the people will say things like the institution won't love you back, or your work won't love you back. And so in that sense, she is a cautionary tale, because if you let other people decide things for you, kind of that's often how it ends up, especially if you are not sort of at the top of the rung of the power structure. And I think writing her, a lot of the way that I wrote her was a way of exercising frustration I have with myself, especially, in the last like 10 years. I just turned 40. But realizing in adulthood that you are every day, and that you are like among, maybe not the last to learn it, but like definitely not in the first group of people to learn it. So, depending on who you are, you have access to different forms of information. And I think if you're raised in sort of like going to elite institutions, people around you are saying, oh, well, you're so smart, you are the kind of brightest of the brightest, so you know everything. And then you get into life and you're like, no, we don't know anything. And there are people who are excluded from all our political processes who have a lot more information and different kinds of information. So I think realizing that as I've gotten older was and you feel like disgusted with yourself sometimes. It's just like, why did I not know? And so I wanted to write that into a person. And so Bunny kind of takes the flack for that in a lot of ways. But I'm also, even though there is some kind of like despair and cynical note in that novel, although also I hope like some humor and fun for readers, because reading novels should be fun. The way that I avoid that in my own life is by being inspired by other people who are taking action every day, in whatever form that looks like. And sometimes it's, very messy. And so, a group like this, people are doing things, people are trying to do things. And then, yeah, right now, I mean, I worked really hard on a universal preschool campaign in Multnomah County, where I live. I did that through the Democratic Socialists of America, which I had been sort of like a member for a long time, but wasn't really that active in. And then COVID happened, and I was working on this book, and we had won the universal preschool. So I was like, well, I'm kind of not doing anything right now. I'll pay attention, but I'm working on this other stuff and stuck home with my kids. And then, when, October 7th happened and the assault on Gaza, I've actually gone back, and it sort of politically activated me in a way that feels really awful, that's what it takes. But also I think in those moments when you feel really horrified by what's happening in the world, you do seek out other people who care and who are working on it. And that is what sort of can stave off despair, even if you can't solve the problem with any individual thing that you're doing. But yes, in terms of party politics, I haven't felt worse about them in like recent memory, because Donald Trump truly terrifies me. I still can't believe that. I can't believe this is where we are. But I also can't believe that Joe Biden is, in my view, kind of handing the presidency to Trump, potentially because of like choices that he's making right now, or his administration is making. And that I don't even know what to do with that. So I think, yeah, focusing on local issues has become very important to me, because that is where you have more measure of control, I guess, or not control, but like agency.
Thank you.
I have a question. Well, it's sort of a question. Alicia mentioned the ambivalence about Bunny as a character, and I understood that from the novel, that we were supposed to not like her, but I did like her. I liked her a lot. And then you talked about her being kind of, her life being determined by her circumstances, that she was not very, quote, self-directed. But, you know, in the end, she really was, it seemed to me, quite self-directed. And I just wonder if we didn't like her choices. I mean, it was like, why should we be mad at her? Because had this been a male character during the same time frame, doing the same thing, whether it was exploring their sexuality or kind of not knowing what they wanted to do, or feeling lukewarm support for their mom, who was in a kind of a difficult place, and then going out working for the oil industry. I mean, I just feel like we would have related to him differently. We wouldn't have wanted to hate him.
That is such a great point, and thank you for raising it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, also, so when I say I, think of this as a feminist novel, I grew up, the novels that shaped me as a person and a reader were novels by men and about men, very unlikable men, sort of like happily, like joyfully unlikable men, and that's what was appealing about them in many ways. And then I think becoming an adult and sort of realizing what it means that is what has shaped your worldview and sort of your view of the arts, especially, like, so profoundly. It's really something that I think about a lot, even though I don't have an answer for it necessarily. And I don't say that in the sense of like I want to throw away all of those books, because I still love them, but sometimes I revisit things that were so important to me, and I'm like, wow, this book, this is by someone who like doesn't think that women are people, or like, isn't, there's no need for them to think about like women's humanity or personhood. And one thing that I feel like not enough people notice this in the book, but it's so like important to me. And I think actually it's sort of a failure, because I ended up being too kind. More developed politics than Bunny, and has like very strident views and expresses them. He's also a horrible asshole. And even with that, he's sort of allowed by the novel, and by kind of our society, to be like a redemptive or kind of likable character, in a way that Bunny, she's not doing anything worse than what most people are doing. She's not bad. Like, she's not making awful, like hurting people intentionally, but she still carries the weight of our judgment in a way that a character like he does not. And I had a bookseller talk to me about that once. He was a young man, and he was like, I really like Charlie. Charlie's the one who, like, he's right about everything. And I'm like, yeah, he's right, but like, what else? Like, what else is he doing? And like, why does he? I feel like some people, like, quote unquote, like good politics come easier to some people than others. And sometimes we kind of privilege like having kind of coherent and well-expressed political beliefs. We conflate that with like being a good person, and they're not always the same thing at all. So that was something I wanted to think about. And yeah, I mean, it's funny when I read like I don't read Goodreads reviews anymore because I realized it was self-harm. Because so many people on Goodreads like hate the book or, just completely. And like sometimes they hate it in a way that I think is funny, where it's just like they're kind of revealing that they don't think women are people, and they're just like, this is boring. I don't want to read about like this woman's life, or like, why does it talk about shoes? But sometimes I remember the first time I read one where it was just like, I love this book because like this character's so awful. I hate her so much, but like I love the book. I was kind of like, well, I'm glad you love the book, but like it did smart. I was surprised by how, even though I had absolutely invited that interpretation, I did feel a little bit protective of her. And then at the same time, I would see a review that was like, this is a great story about like women's empowerment and making your way in the world. And then I'd be like, no, that's not like, that's also not exactly it. So I think that's one thing about writing a book is you put it out there and it's just like, people will take from it what they will. And it's certainly interesting to notice what people do take, but there's also unconscious stuff that I won't even see about it. That's kind of the work of readers of the future, is to be like, well, what was this woman's problem? Who wrote this novel? But thank you for that question and observation.
Okay,
I think Irene has a
yeah,
question.
Irini?
Hi, Lydia. So I wanted to make it's the Kafeneion, and I'm in Athens, so I can do first topothetici. So I just wanted to say about your novel Golden State. As a new mother and an ex-smoker, I found aspects of that book really difficult. So yeah, thanks for that. You basically, everybody's been asking the same question kind of, but I was trying to, I found the character of Bunny uncomfortable. Like I was thinking that if I was in some social situation where I was sitting next to this person, I would just feel like uncomfortable and not know how to relate. But I was trying to think about how to ask you about, you answered a lot of the questions that I had. But I thought about a way that I could think about Bunny. And in some respects, the character from the first book, whose name I can't remember. I wonder if you could talk about them in relationship to the literary convention of the like anti-hero or anti-heroine. I mean, were they supposed to be, is that still a thing? Was that a thing for you?
Definitely. I mean, I think the way I sort of think of them in my head is like the Dirtbag novel. I love some of my favorite novels are kind of dirtbag novels or TV shows where it's kind of following someone who's just stumbling around and like making weird choices and doesn't really know what they're doing. And I actually already mentioned this book in the context of Bridget Jones, but the novel Lucky Jim is one that I read again as a very young person. And it's about, this young man who's stumbling through life and making questionable choices and like drinking too much. And it's a very funny novel. And, I look back on it differently now, but I think having a female character who was sort of in that same vein of like just kind of a discomfort in the world and a clumsiness moving through it in a sense that was also comic, I guess, was something that I thought a lot about, especially when they were young. I think where Bunny became harder for me to write and is when I kind of put her in like true adulthood, just as, being a true adult sometimes feels difficult and sort of like, oh, now you have to actually become a person and you can't just sort of like fumble your way through life. Or, I mean, I guess you can, but you have maybe more of an expectation of yourself that you need to grow up a little bit. So I think both Bunny and Daphne, I have a lot of their foibles and their kind of, those are more, I have empathy for them because I have felt that way myself. But I kind of wanted to show both of them in positions. They're not the same character, but we have sort of like a Venn diagram, I guess. And I wanted to show them facing that that question of what does it mean to grow up? And in the case of Daphne, it's like, now you have this child, you need to take care of her as well as yourself. And how are you doing that? Maybe not so well, but in a way that I think a lot of people find themselves when they're suddenly faced with caring for another human. And in the case of Bunny, it's like, oh, now you've done school, you've left the nest of your sort of strange insular upbringing, and now you have to be in the world. And how do you want to do that?
Okay, Christina, go ahead.
Thank you for indulging me again. I have kind of a practical question, much related though to motherhood, as I've heard my toddler scream in the other room during this discussion. What was your process in the conceptualization of this book? Kind of what first was the spark that particularly, I can imagine the inspiration from your background as a foreign service kid, but where did the oil part come in, and how did you write it during the pandemic with 2 children? I mean, how long did it take you? And I'm sure that kind of catalyzed a lot of the work that you do for childcare and other mothers, which has also been really, I've appreciated reading about, but I am curious about your process.
So I had to, when the pandemic started, I had just gotten sort of into like a groove of what I thrashed around a lot with, like, for maybe a couple years, what the book even was about. And like the oil part kind of started to come in. I had just come up with the character of Charlie and like written the first scenes. We had just moved to Portland in 2019 from San Francisco. We moved in the fall of 2019. I, got through moving hell. And then finally, and my kids were like in preschool, and I established a little bit of a writing routine. And then the pandemic happened. And so I just didn't work on it at all. Like, I was with my kids were really young, and it was just horrible. And I was like, if I have time to write, I'm going to work on stuff that I can get paid for. I don't know where this is going. I don't have any mental space to work on it. So I just didn't. And then after like 7 months, I told my husband, like, I need to leave to work. I want to work on it again, but I can't do it here. So I rented a very cheap cabin, like 45 minutes away from Portland. And I went for 3 nights, and it had a compostable toilet. And it was not very luxurious, but it was heaven because I had been so cooped up. So it was actually, like, in retrospect, it was kind of genius to do it that way, because I bundled the pleasure of being away from my family with the writing. And normally it can be very difficult to make yourself write, but here it was kind of like, you get to go away and you can do whatever you want, and there will be no kids. And also you can work on your book. And so I did that after 6 months. I went away for 3 nights and wrote like 10,000 words. And then I waited 7 months, and then I did it again. And then I kind of, that second sort of getaway, I actually felt like maybe I can really finish a draft of this. So then I went away a total of 6 times for 1 to 3 nights each time. And that was, of course, like, I needed to have a partner, a co-parent who was supportive and who I could say, I'm leaving to do this. And that was very lucky, but that's kind of what I had to do. And now that I don't need to, like, my kids are at school right now. So like, maybe I could write, but I feel the call of like the tiny cabin and sort of like, maybe that's how I need to write all my books, because I just think having silence is so hard when you're a parent. And I know parents who are able to do it all, like they have full-time jobs, they have kids, and they're writing on the side. I simply don't have the fortitude for that. I can't do that. So I have to kind of create sort of little pockets for myself to do that, to write.
Stacey?
Okay, my question is very simple. Who's Bunny gonna vote for on the 5th of November? I found your comment of voting uncommitted quite interesting, because I think those of us that are out there campaigning continuously are running up against this. And when people tell me, well, there's Gretchen, there's Newsom, there's all these other people, why is Papu running? I'm interested in who Bunny would want.
Well, I think Bunny is is it called a blue dog Democrat? Is that someone who votes Democrat no matter what? Whatever. Bunny's never gonna not. Bunny will vote in every election, and she will vote for whoever the candidate is. And may not have high expectations for them. Yeah, I mean, I really empathize, and it's weird. I'm holding two feelings at once. I am both grateful for the people who are doing the sort of campaign work, which feels so or canvassing work right now, which I can't imagine how like thankless that must feel. But I'm also holding some real kind of rage at the Biden administration, and so my view is kind of like, until the election, I can the whole point of threats is that they need to be meaningful. And I don't want to tell Biden he has my vote preemptively if there's still a chance that he could try to get it. So far, he's not showing any signs that he's really worried about me as a voter. And I do live in Oregon, which is a very reliably blue state, at least in the presidential sense. So I'm not sure how much it matters, but I do think it's important, in our democratic process, as someone mentioned, like gerrymandering in the beginning of this conversation, it is so kind of bleak how the right wing is engineering our process to make it as hostile as possible to anyone, any liberal, let alone someone who's really left. And that is horrifying. And so it's I don't want to cede any more ground there, but then also it's if we are in this process, we're supposed to be able to demand something of the people who represent us. And it just kind of feels like who is who's listening. It's hard, but thank you for trying to get people activated, because it's again, I can't think of anything worse than a Trump presidency again. But it feels bleak right now.
But see, Lydia, you're articulating the problem exactly, that we don't want Trump, but we're not 100% behind Biden because, okay, since October, we've had some big issues with what the administration is supporting. I think there's been a movement over the last 2 months that is coming through very, very clearly. But is that going to be enough to stop, number one, what's going on in Gaza right now? We're all, fingers crossed and lighting candles to say, please, let's hear that, tomorrow there's going to be a ceasefire and that will be it and we'll be done. But, as it progresses, it doesn't seem like it. And, those little flickers of hope are out there, but how long can you hold on for?
Let's hope we can hold on till the election. Stephen, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Lydia. I had the pleasure of reading both of your books recently. I just wanted to say I was really interested in how both of your main characters have these sort of conflicted allegiances between sort of different competing ideals or senses of self. I wanted to ask you about how you wrote about place in mobility. I know that you talked a little bit about this with Alicia, but writing about Baku or writing about Athens, what was the sort of combination of memory, online research, and you talked about visiting a little bit, but maybe especially about Athens, you could talk about how did that sort of alchemy come together?
Well, thank you so much. I'd say the writing about Athens and about Greece, that felt easy, just because that was so based in my own kind of yearning and nostalgia. And I think one of the weird things about being a foreign service brat is that you end up forming these really intense attachments to places that you don't have any claim on. So it's weird. My daughters, they're 9 and 6, and they've been to Greece a few times now to visit my dad and Regina, and they love it. And my older one especially is she's forming an attachment, which makes me happy. But I'm so like, I can sometimes she'll be telling other people about it. She's like, well, we went to visit my, grandpa in Greece, and you can see them sort of assuming that we're Greek American. And I sort of have to quickly be like, we're not Greek American. Like, I'm not going to claim, I don't have any sort of like claim to Greek heritage. And I think that's sort of a common thing among foreign service brats or like military brats or Aramco kids. Like a place that feels like home really isn't your home in a lot of ways. And you may not speak the language. Like I can understand some things when people speak Greek to me, but I can't speak Greek. Like I can order food in a restaurant. And so I think writing the kind of Greece and Athens parts was a way to like just kind of get those feelings out. And yeah, find a place to kind of put them. Writing the Baku part was really, that was a different kind of challenge because I had not been there, and we had been posted to Yerevan, Armenia, which is not the same place. But like, I didn't want to write, sort of a straightforward, like, this is everything that happened in my life. I actually wanted to like stretch. And when I started reading about what was happening in Baku at that time, it was really interesting to me in a lot of ways. And so that was like, I watched a lot of YouTube videos from like 1990s, but YouTube is actually an amazing resource, especially people who are obsessed with like transportation will just upload tram videos from different cities. I actually ended up writing, after the research process, I wrote a thing for the New York Times Magazine about YouTube time travel, because you can just put in like a city name and a decade, and you can find just random home videos that people will put. And so I found videos that people just posted of Baku in the 90s and even before. And one thing that I was learning in my reading is that, like many kind of petrostates, the pace of change in the physical landscape has been mind-boggling, apparently. And so I was aware that even when I went, I was not going to be going to the place that I was writing about. So that's why it was important that I enlist the kind of editorial eye of someone who had grown up, so that she could look. And she actually was like, she had more to say about, like, she was like, more people would have been staring at her and like saying saying stuff to her, which I was like, I didn't want to assume that, so I hadn't written that in. And she was like, no, the thing that feels wrong is that she would just walk through the city and have people not sort of talk to her constantly. But yeah, I mean, it was difficult. And then when I went, I just walked. I walked all the places that I had written about. I ended up walking like 45 miles in 4 days, and like really messed up one of my feet for a long time afterward. But it was, it was such a wonderful like experience to be able to do that, and just to kind of see a city that way and see it through the eyes of really having like tried to imagine it for a long time. And then kind of be there in the flesh. So I mean, I did the best I could, and was happy that, yeah, I had the chance to go. And I actually had the same experience with writing about Texas too, because I had not spent time there. And when I did go, I did a lot of just sort of like looking and trying to feel like what it felt like in the air and things like that.
I guess that was humid. Felt a lot of humidity in the air there. Brady? Where'd he go? Well, I would like to say, while Brady is trying to tune in, that that I really enjoyed your book, Lydia, and that I felt like you had your finger on the pulse of what it must be like to be a child that is moving around the world. I think that, moving to and from America provided maybe more grounding than for some children who are connected to a foreign service, but not a national foreign service. So they never go back home. They're just, always away. And like my children, they never really lived in the United States, but they do now as adults. I've given them your book because I thought maybe they would see something in it that they could relate to.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a wonderful group to speak with, and I love the questions and the generosity. And Alicia, you are like an idol to me. So thank you for doing this. And
Well, let me say that it is wonderful to see so many people that I am extremely fond of on the screen, starting obviously with my daughter. And it was not my idea to invite her, Sarah Jane's, and we owe a great debt to Sarah Jane for having the idea and making it happen. Reading Lydia's books, I find out all kinds of things about her that I did not know before, which is good. And I know that the literary character is not the human being, but you can put a few additional data points together to create, a wonderful picture of the author as a as a Foreign Service child. And anyway, I'd like to say hi to Paul. It's been a long time since seen you, but at the embassy together a couple of decades ago. I think the Foreign Service does offer amazing opportunities, but at a cost. And I'm so happy, Lydia, that you have transformed the trauma of your childhood into something something so readable and enjoyable even. So
no, it was
anyway,
it was
thank
a
you very
privilege
much.
to grow up that way.
Okay, before we say goodbye, I would like Gina, who I work with on Kafenion. Well, actually, all of XCOM works on Kafenion. So thank you for all of you for, all that you do to make this happen. But Gina, who is my co-conspirator, really would like to talk about what is coming up. And I'm going to share a screen with the announcement while she talks to you.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. And thank you so much, Lydia and Alicia. This was just delightful. I confess, I have not yet read Mobility because I didn't find a way to order the book that wasn't over Amazon and I boycott them, but okay, I'm on it. And I did talk to 5 bookshops in Germany where I was recently and asked them, please, why don't you have this book in your English section? So maybe you'll get some more readers from there. Our next Kafenion is coming up on Juneteenth, the 19th of June, and it's going to be my great pleasure to introduce to you a woman from my past. Her name is Renee Seiler, and she and I worked together decades ago in Birmingham, Alabama. She was the weekend anchor, and I was a general assignment reporter. I got out of the news business, but Renee stayed in it for many, many years, among other things, going on to become the first Black woman to anchor an early morning news program in the USA. And as she told us recently in a meeting, if you haven't been fired, you're not really in TV news. At any rate, she's going to be joining us from her home in Georgia. And the topic is going to be where she introduces her new podcast that will be launching soon. And it's called A Black Woman Told Me. And what she's going to be doing is answering any question any of us may have about race relations. She'll be sharing very intimate stories of her own life from childhood on in California and all across the United States, where I think it's a great opportunity for us as Democrats and Democrats abroad to hear what I personally believe is one of the main underlying currents of the MAGA movement, and that's racism. Just the United States not completely or adequately or at all, depending on your viewpoint, confronting our past with this issue. I hope you'll make plans to join us. I can only promise that Renee is a delightful, warm speaker, and I'm so delighted that she's agreed to join us on this evening. She's a woman who's done amazing things and continues to do them, and we're looking forward to welcoming her and hopefully all of you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sarah Jane, for the opportunity to work with you in this amazing event that I love, Kafenion. Thanks.
Thanks, Gina. I do hope y'all all join us with Renee. She's a very candid person, and we had a great discussion. I mean, it was so candid that, me white lady could ask her, do I refer to you as Black or do I refer to you as African American? I mean, because everybody has a different preference. And I felt like a lot of us have some of these like potholes that we're avoiding. And the answer is there's no right answer. And it was really nice to have this really frank conversation with her. And I think that maybe we'll all enjoy talking with her. So hope to see you then.
Excuse me, Sarah Jane, I forgot to say something really important. Sorry. You know, and a lot of what she'll be talking about is her experience of learning about her own history, not at school, but really late in life. I mean, I recall this for my own self, just not learning about things in school, and especially in light of these new bans on what you can teach and what you can't teach in some states, and what you can read and what you can't read. I think it's really, really key that we talk about these things. So sorry for butting in again.
That's all right. Thanks. Would anybody else like to say anything before we sign off? No? All right. Well, I just want to thank our guests, Alicia and Lydia, so much for being with us and taking us on this little trip tonight. It was wonderful listening to both of you and to all the comments. Christina, thank you so much for being our reader and reflector in-house tonight. And
thank you for organizing. I did want to say that to Sarah Jane and Gina, and they really encouraged me. Not that I needed encouragement once I started the book, but as a new mom, they were like, read this book, you'll relate, come on. So they helped me finally kind of chart out the time that I needed, and I deeply enjoyed it. So thank you all for organizing this great discussion, and to Lydia, of course, for writing a fantastic book and having this whole engaging session.
You're welcome. And Karen, do you want to make that one more announcement before we leave?
Which one more announcement were you thinking of?
Registering.
Oh, registering. Yes,
Registering to vote. I see you put something in the chat.
Yeah, I put it in the chat twice. If you live outside the United States, the easiest way to register, if you haven't done it already, is to go to votefromabroad.org. The instructions are there for your state. All the deadlines are there. If you need help, you can get help either through the chat bot, or we even have Zoom rooms where you can tune in and get hands-on help. Let's see, what else would I say? I also put in the website. We have a Greek page, we have articles, we have events, we have stuff. But I mean, it's a huge site. It's extremely rich, lots of caucuses, lots of action, people working on all sorts of things, doing door knocks in Washington, D.C. to get your taxes straightened out. Good grief. It's just unbelievable. So check that out too when you have time. And I think you've got one more chair that might want to say something about keeping the lights on.
Excuse me? Oh.
Stacy might want to put a word in.
Who? Do you want Brady to? I think Brady is.
If Stacy is gone, Brady could.
Well, I don't see Stacy, but what Stacy meant to say was that all of these events are a way of bringing together a community of like-minded people with interesting things to say. And we hope that you will appreciate Democrats Abroad Greece as a positive force in the world. And it's very easy to go to our website and donate a few euros to say thank you to, to Sarah Jane, to say thank you to Lydia, to say thank you to Alicia. And we will find a way to make sure that the money you donate somehow causes good things to happen in the general direction of all of the people who need it. So anyway, so good night, everyone. I think we've spoken long enough. It's 9 o'clock. So let's say it's a wrap.
All right. Good night. And
good night.
Last thing. Now I'm going to read the Golden State.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.